Public Relations. Edward L. Bernays. 1945. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 1. The Growth of Public Relations. 10. Public Relations Comes of Age, 1929 to 1941. The period from 1929 to 1941 was marked by tremendous changes in this country and in the world. The stock market crash of 1929 rocked the country. The Depression that followed was America's greatest economic crisis. President Hoover entered the White House in 1929 as the symbol of prosperity. He left it in 1933 as the symbol of debacle. He was followed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who occupied the White House for 12 years. Profound economic, social, and political changes in America and around the globe took place, accompanied by propaganda, publicity, and public relations on a scale never known before. Carrying forward the tenets of the reform movements that had developed since the Civil War and had found expression in legislation under Cleveland, Theodore Roosevelt, and Wilson, President Franklin Roosevelt initiated far-reaching reforms. His actions precipitated nationwide debate on such issues as the National Industrial Recovery Act, the New Deal, attempts to change the Supreme Court, the recognition of Russia, farm legislation, and other proposals. Events abroad also had their impact on the United States, and public opinion was aroused on the issues raised by Russia, Japan, China, Hitler, Mussolini, collective security, and Spain. The conflicts of the era reached their climax in World War II, which broke out in Europe in the fall of 1939. 2 years later, Pearl Harbor brought America into the greatest war in history. The stock market crash and the Depression had a profound effect on public opinion and public relations. Public opinion had been steadily gaining importance since the turn of the century. In World War I, that importance was recognized by America's leaders, both in government and in business. Now, however, the impact of the public upon the public relationship of government, business, labor, and other groups reached a new high. One of the chief reasons for this was the fact that the Depression had destroyed the security of millions. Among the dispossessed farmers and along the lines of unemployed workers there was talk of revolution. Banks had failed, wiping out the savings of a lifetime. Business enterprises had gone bankrupt, throwing millions into the street. John Steinbeck realized that the Depression brought into question all the basic assumptions of American society. In The Grapes of Wrath he presented the problem as the social welfare of the people versus the social situation. And the sense of insecurity of millions of Americans nourished 3 propaganda campaigns that swept the country. Dr. Francis E. Townsend, with his Townsend Plan, founded in January 1934, in California, gathered strong support for a pension plan to be undertaken by the federal government. Under this plan, the government was to pay $200 monthly to every unemployed person of good character over 60 years of age, the stipend to be wholly spent before the next payday. So widespread was the interest in this movement that it helped speed the passage through Congress of the Social Security Act in 1935, although the Townsend Crusade itself was discredited after it had run its course. Similarly, the Share the Wealth campaign of Senator Huey Long of Louisiana struck deep root in the Middle West and on the Pacific Coast. Long's proposal was a vague scheme for redistributing private fortune so that every deserving family in the nation might have sufficient income to own a car, a home, and a radio. This movement affected the passage by Congress of an increased income tax on wealth in August 1935. The third campaign was initiated by Father Colin in Michigan in 1934. He organized the National Union for Social Justice, which advocated nationalization of banks, credit, utilities, and natural resources. In January 1935, in a radio broadcast, many members of the National Union protested against America's joining the World Court. Then, in 1938, Father Colin formed an anti-Semitic organization called the Christian Front. These 3 activities created throughout the country an awareness of the need for developing greater psychological security about economic security. It was only natural, in this crisis, for the public to make its voice felt in political and social action. What the public did was to make business the scapegoat. It denounced the leaders of commerce, industry, and finance, charging them with direct responsibility for the Depression. This denunciation led to a profound change in the relations between business and the public. The rising trend of business and of public relations after World War I had made the businessman the most important member of the community until 1929. His was the dominant voice in the marketplace of conflicting ideas. The public listened with the greatest respect to anything a tycoon had to say. He was considered a supreme authority not only on business but on art, religion, and music as well. The Depression changed all this. As the White House and the public denounced bankers and industrialists for making the Depression, businessmen maintained a hurt silence. From 1929 to 1936 all the talking was done and the public relations was practiced by the critics of business. Business lost its voice and accepted the National Industrial Recovery Act. Then in the middle 30s came the Great Turn. The Depression began to lift. The public began to regain its sense of security and its faith. Under these circumstances, business lost its fear and found its voice again. This turn of events had important consequences for the profession of public relations. As a result of the Depression, public relations had greatly enlarged its activities. Business now realized that in addition to selling its products under the unfavorable conditions of economic decline, it needed also and above all to sell itself to the public, to explain its contributions to the entire economic system. Business recognized that if it did not do so, conflicting ideas might abolish or modify business itself. Then, too, the increasing attention given by universities, publicists, and writers to the importance of sound public relations in the maintenance of our system of enterprise made business aware of the need for modifying its attitudes and actions to conform to public demands, as well as for getting the public to understand its position. Prior to the Depression, the public relations activities of industry were, to a large extent, confined to trade associations and the larger corporations. Trade associations that had specific problems of public relations competition, taxes, sales difficulties called in the expert on public opinion. The coal, meat, and oil industries were cases in point. There was the tax problem. For instance, chain stores were faced by a wave of special taxes. And there were problems of markets, such as maintaining and developing markets for artificial flowers, concrete roads, velvets, or citrus fruits. Competing products, such as coal and oil, steel and wood, vegetable fat and animal fat, utilized public relations methods to make clear to the public the advantage of one over another. The public relations activities of large corporations were of the same general character. They were faced with the problem of maintaining and developing leadership in their fields. They often used public relations techniques to develop members of their own organizations as symbols of leadership. Prior to 1929, these two broad fields of action in industry kept the public relations men busy, either as professional advisors on the outside, or in corporations or trade association as officers charged with public relations activities. Then came the Depression and Deflation. For a time business made little attempt to grapple with the new conditions. Industries like steel, wood, coal, oil, velvet, and silk did not think there were markets worth fighting for on the old basis of important cooperative effort in public relations. The deflation of stocks, bonds, and general values caused a recession of trade association public relations activities. But while the efforts of trade associations in public relations activities languished, the large corporations realigned their public relations policies and efforts. They were faced with entirely new conditions in the market. They needed experts who could keep them constantly informed about the new demands of the public. Corporations and leaders had lost prestige simultaneously. From a market standpoint, the public was keenly sensitive, because of its feeling of insecurity, to everything about a corporation that it did not understand. Companies were exposed on all sides to attacks from the most unexpected quarters. Not only had many leaders lost their prestige with the public, but sales of products fell off for the most improbable and unlikely reasons. False rumors, for example, that X company was inimical to Catholics, Jews, or Protestants, or that the product was short-weight. No possible subject that could be a matter of disagreement between groups of the public was too trivial to cause a wave of public disapproval or a falling off in buying. To meet this situation, the Public Relations Council was called in at all hours of the day or night to rush to the fire and put out what might well have spread into a disastrous conflagration. Advising and aiding in the rebuilding of established reputations that had been blasted and attempting to develop new reputations were significant public relations tasks of the period. The day of the straw man and the stuffed shirt was over. The United States no longer wanted idols with feet of clay. It wanted real heroes who kept pace with the changing times and who anticipated changing conditions by changing policies and actions in advance of public pressure or law. The public now wanted business leaders who recognized that private business is a public trust. Trade associations came back, too, not only in the previous fields of action but mainly in connection with their relationship to government. The NRA created many public relations problems for a number of industries. Industry also woke up and recognized that the Huey Longs, the Cochlans, the Townsends, and other demagogues who flooded America with economic and other isms might really be undermining the basis of our economic system. Business leaders began to realize that they had neglected many important phases of their own existence. Among them were these. 1. Adherence to the principle that, to survive, private business must always be in the public interest. 2. Recognition of the fact that the public interest is a changing concept and business must change with it. 3. Understanding that the place of business in the American system must be sold to the public. 4. Awareness that public relations techniques can help to do this. In the first 2 years of the 30s, corporations began the now common method of direct mailing to their stockholders. The National Association of Manufacturers advertisements of that period took up defensive business in warning against those who would strive to pit class against class. The year 1935-36 marked the beginning of institutional advertising by the United States Steel Corporation. Many examples of this type of institutional advertising by business appeared during the Depression. But it was a one-way communication with an attempt by business to sell ideas just as it had previously sold products. The Democratic landslide of 1936 indicated to business that it had failed in selling its ideas. In January 1937, Business Week made this clear: business is up against an impossible job trying to make the masses think it is 100% good. This helps to explain the spectacular failure of some recent campaigns. In April 1937, A. Batten, president of the N.W. Ayer and Son, speaking before the Association of National Advertisers, gave a definition of great astuteness and integrity as regards public relations. Too many manufacturers, he said, neglect their corporate health and then scream for the public relations herb doctor. Any public relations worthy of the name must start with the business itself. Unless the business is so organized and so administered that it can meet at every point the test of good citizenship and of usefulness to the community, no amount of public relations will avail. When the trade associations came back to a public relations point of view in the middle 1930s, they did so with a difference. They now recognize the importance of public relations not only for their own specific problems but also for the broader problems of business as a whole. They realized that it was not enough to pay lip service to the principles of Adam Smith. What was important was to modify policies and actions in regard to labor, wages, and similar topics in the light of a changed America and a changed world. Great trade associations began to deal with these problems from a realistic public relations standpoint. And when reactionary leaders of an industry refused to face the all-important fact that America and the world had changed, liberal leaders did their best to enlighten them. A turning point in the history of public relations, as well as of business, came in this period when large aggregations of industry developed campaigns that attempted to rationalize and integrate business into the thinking of the American people. Along these lines, the United States Chamber of Commerce carried on important public relations activities through the Nation's Business, edited by Merle Thorpe. So, too, the National Association of Manufacturers, under the leadership of Colby Chester, conducted public relations campaigns in many different ways and along many fronts to explain business to the public. At the same time, large corporations expanded their public relations activities. Under the leadership of the late Edward R. Stettinius, Jr., the United States Steel Corporation appointed J. Carlisle MacDonald as its public relations officer. He inaugurated U.S. Steel News to interpret the company to its employees. The American Iron and Steel Institute appointed John Wiley Hill to a similar post, while Merle Crowell became public relations officer for the Rockefeller Center interests. At the same time, the already existing public relations officers of various corporations expanded their activities. This was true in the case of Arthur Page of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, of Paul Garrett of General Motors, of Northrop Clary for the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, and of R. Gordon Wasson for J.P. Morgan and Company. Outside Public Relations Counsel also enlarged their field of activity for their clients. Ivy Lee's firm, now called Ivy Lee and T.J. Ross, stepped up their work for their old client, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and others. Our own professional activity from 1930 to 1941 offers case studies which reflect the development of this period in public relations. Business and other groups which came to us did so with heightened recognition that public interest and public opinion were of increasing importance in orienting their own attitudes and actions. The emphasis on information, high spotting, and dramatization became secondary. One characteristic of the period, as exemplified by our clients, was the growing diversity of the interests which sought professional public relations guidance. Among those who now came to us were great jewelers like Cartier, radio broadcasting companies like NBC and CBS, magazine publishers, real estate developments, chemical firms, radio manufacturers, chain stores, fisheries, refrigerator manufacturers, cigarette companies, integrated oil companies, construction firms, and many others. Typical of this general trend was government's recognition of the role of public relations. An example of this was my appointment in 1930 as a member of the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, created by President Hoover shortly after the stock market crash to deal with the emergency. To dramatize the committee's activities, its chairman, Colonel Arthur Woods, spoke by long-distance telephone to all 48 governors, telling them what the federal government was doing to aid employment. All these factors had a profound effect on the mind of business and on the public. The lay, financial, and trade press gave more and more attention to public relations. Meetings of executives in fields as diversified as railroads, banks, and gelatin took keen interest in opinion molding. And Dean Carl Ackerman of Columbia University expressed the spirit of the decade by proposing a public opinion foundation. At the same time, there was widespread discussion of an idea I had proposed in propaganda that the United States government should appoint a Secretary of Public Relations as a member of the President's cabinet. One of the most significant changes in attitude toward public relations was among the bankers. For years prior to the Depression, bankers had been the symbols of our economic civilization. It did not occur to them, or to the public, that our great financial institutions needed counsel on public relations. Now, in growing numbers, they eagerly welcomed such professional advice. By 1939, for example, our own firm was working with the Bank of America on the West Coast and in Washington. Business in America was no longer merely private business, it was now individual enterprise devoted to public business. Nor was business a self-perpetuating right, as some businessmen still seem to think, with practices and rights that must be maintained merely because they had always been maintained before. It was becoming clear to many persons, however, that business could not survive and grow on an emotional credo. It had to be based on the soundest logical foundation: the interest, convenience, and necessity of the public. That America was becoming more aware of the nature and importance of public relations was further evidenced by the active interest now shown in the field by newspapers, magazines, universities, social scientists, research organizations, and political parties. In 1935, for example, I was asked to talk on the subject of propaganda at the Herald Tribune Institute, directed by Mrs. William Brown Melanie. A talk on public relations delivered by Bruce Barton at a convention of businessmen was widely reprinted and commented upon in all kinds of publications. Then, in 1936, the Boston Conference on Distribution covered the subject of public relations thoroughly when its director, Daniel Bloomfield, invited authorities in the field to address the fall meeting. That year, too, Dr. George Gallup, head of the American Institute of Public Opinion, Archibald Crossley, and others drew attention to the techniques of measuring public opinion which were used in the 1936 presidential election. The activities of Charles Michelson, publicity director of the Democratic National Committee, focused further interest on the strategies of working with public opinion. At the same time, popular magazine articles about public relations and public relations experts showed not only an advance in the field, but a growing understanding of it. Henry J. Pringle, in an article entitled Mass Psychologist, which appeared in February 1930, in H. L. Mencken's American Mercury, still spoke of public relations as if it were no more than creating a demand by molding the public mind. But Pringle caught the new spirit when he emphasized that the first task of the Public Relations Council is to see whether his client offers something which the public can be brought to accept. This article was also symptomatic of the times in its emphasis on the social sciences insofar as they affected public relations. Similar emphasis on the importance of the social sciences for modern public relations was made by John T. Flynn. There were echoes of another age in the title of his article on public relations in the May 1932 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. It was called Edward L. Bernays, The Science of Ballyhoo, at a time when public relations was leaning on science and repudiating ballyhoo. But the new era was emphasized when Mr. Flynn spoke of the modern public relations expert as a social psychologist engaged in carrying out in actual practice and according to newer theories that branch of psychology which Auguste Comte and later Herbert Spencer recognized as having a definite relation to sociology. So, too, in 1934 an article in the Literary Digest by Wayne W. Parrish, entitled He Helped Make Press a Gentry of Science, used the phrase opinion management to describe the public relations of the times. Public relations was also discussed and analyzed in books. These used the activities of Ivy Lee and our own firm to illustrate the nature, function, and scope of public relations. Thus S. H. Walker and Paul Sklar, in Business Finds Its Voice, Management's Effort to Sell the Business Idea to the Public, published in 1938, described in some detail the activities we undertook on behalf of Philco in 1934. In connection with those activities, we initiated a practice which became widespread toward the end of the decade: the creation of institutes and foundations as public interest bodies of private profit organizations. Fact Digest for November 1938 credited us with inventing this type of institute. It referred to the suggestion we had made to a number of companies to found public interest bureaus or adjuncts of their regular operations in order to carry on public interest activities which coincided with their private activities. Thus, a velvet manufacturing company would set up a velvet fashion service, a manufacturer of men's clothes would set up a men's style bureau, and so on. These bureaus, services, institutes, and foundations functioned as non-profit institutions in the public interest, but were always tied up with a profit organization. This connection was indicated in the name of the public interest service, which might be called, for example, the Style Bureau for Men in the XYZ Corporation. One of the best known of these public service units was the United Brewers Foundation, which we helped to organize for the brewing industry in 1937. By this time, the colleges and universities of the United States were keenly aware of the dependence of government, industry, and all other social groups on public opinion. Prominent scholars and organizations devoted to the social sciences therefore gave an increasing amount of time and attention to analyzing and interpreting public relations. In 1937, we surveyed public relations training in American colleges and universities and reported the results in a brochure entitled Universities Pathfinders in Public Opinion. We found that institutions of higher learning now offered a wide variety of courses on public relations and allied subjects. Cornell University, the University of Minnesota, Bucknell University, Brooklyn College, Ohio State University, and Rutgers University gave courses in public opinion, propaganda and public opinion and methods of argument, the formation of public opinion, control of public opinion, the press and public opinion, and so on. College textbooks were also discussing public relations, among them Curtis D. McDougall's A College Course in Reporting for Beginners. In 1937, Boston merchant Edward A. Filene, with whom we had worked, decided that he wanted to do something to make people think about propaganda. He organized the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, with an advisory board which included the historians Charles A. Beard and James T. Shotwell, economist and now United States Senator Paul Douglas, and sociologist Robert S. Lind. The Institute's first activity was the publication of Propaganda Analysis, a monthly letter, to help intelligent citizens detect and analyze propaganda, foreign and domestic. It set up classifications for propaganda: the name-calling device, glittering generalities, transfer in terms of approved symbols and sanctions, testimonial, plain folks device, card stacking, and bandwagon. In a sense, the Institute's activity was propaganda against propaganda. It helped to create a certain amount of cynicism and deflation for the printed and spoken word, and built up barriers in the public mind against the acceptance of propaganda. At the same time, university presses and conferences promoted serious study in the field. In 1934, Princeton University Press published Professor Harwood L. Child's A Reference Guide to the Study of Public Opinion. 2 years later, the Institute of Public Affairs conducted by the University of Virginia devoted a session to public relations, and Bucknell University did likewise. In 1940, Professor Childs, in his An Introduction to Public Opinion, defined public relations thus. Public relations may be defined as those aspects of our personal and corporate behavior which have social and public significance. When you define public relations, you also define private relations, as the two are separated by a very thin line. This line is changing constantly. All we can hope to do is draw it as it is today. More and more of our acts are taking on public significance. We need to define personal freedom in terms of social responsibility. A public relations executive is a student of public interest so that he can maximize the social benefits from his services. Consequently, public relations is more than a new ism in management. Public relations is based on public interest. By this definition, he pointed up the factors which we had been stressing in public relations since 1923. Members of our organization frequently participated in these widespread discussions of public relations, hoping that out of our long and diversified experience we might contribute to a clarification of the private and the public interest aspects of public relations as a 20th century profession. In the April 1930 issue of Financial Diary, for example, I wrote, "Since every corporation engaged in business must depend upon the public for its support and its success, it is important that every public contact be consistent with company policy, and that company policy be based on sound understanding of the public. Need for skill and experience in directing and supervising these public contacts has developed a new profession, Public Relations Counsel. The new profession provides new help for organizations trying to solve the ever more complex and complicated problems of reaching company objectives. How can business hear what the public has to say? How can it modify its actions to conform to the public's desires? How can it speak to the public in a language the public understands and appreciates? The modern way is through the services of an expert in public opinion. It is the function of the public relations man to help two partners, business and the public, to understand each other and to supplement each other so that the business may develop to the advantage of both. In 1935, I tried to analyze the counseling function of public relations in an article which appeared in the May issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. It was a sign of the times that this issue was wholly devoted to the theme of pressure groups and propaganda. My contribution, which dealt with molding public opinion, tried to analyze the meaning of such terms as the public and group leadership, and such factors as symbols and human motivations. Then I discussed 4 specific steps that have to be taken in formulating a public relations program. 1. Formulation of objectives. 2. Analysis of the public's attitude towards the industry and the services it renders. 3. A study of this analysis with a view to keynoting the approach to the public in terms of action by the industry, this study to be followed by the formulation of policy and a program for educating the public. And 4. The carrying out of this program by dramatizing it through the various media of communication. The idea of integration with society through a type of public relations which identifies public with private interest was again stressed in a talk I made in 1936 before the Council on Retail Distribution. At this time I emphasized the need for business to redefine its function and re-evaluating itself in the relationship of the other factors in the civilization in which it is operating. The businessman, I pointed out, needs an expert in public relations to appraise his public, to understand it, and to recommend ways of conforming to public desire and need, as well as ways to interpret the policies and acts of his business to the public. This talk emphasized that in every case private and public interest must coincide if business is to maintain its important position in our economic and social life. Significant of the times was that by 1938, Fortune, the magazine of business, took cognizance of public relations for the first time since the founding of the magazine 3 years earlier. The October issue included an article which pointed out that America's favorite subject of attack was business. The American people, Fortune said, had never really been sold on business, particularly the modern, industrial variety. Now the supposed cure for this situation, the article continued, is what the businessman calls public relations. The term is a broad one and may include all sorts of promotional activity, from commercial advertising to after-dinner speeches, and certain companies have defined and executed it with no little success. Thus, after 15 years, the idea of the new public relations had penetrated without being defined, and even at this late date public relations was still widely considered as a form of verbal magic. Fortune went on to say that the public relations job of business has fallen considerably short of perfection. It has not even induced the people to trust the businessman. The people suspect that behind his promotion copy the businessman is up to something. The public distrusted business, according to Fortune, because public relations at that moment were not candid. What business needed was a new concept of public relations. Then, in the March 1939 issue of Fortune, an article about General Motors described the activities of Paul Garrett as the company's public relations director, that Garrett's job was to carry out a long-range program of finding out what people like and doing more of it, then finding out what people don't like and doing less of it. Examining the social horizons of General Motors, Fortune suggested that the company's chairman, Alfred P. Sloan, had more to think about than profits. This was the first time an important magazine had reported a corporation's public relations. Indeed, that issue of Fortune went further. In an article on business and government, it warned that American business could avoid committing suicide only by practicing sound public relations. The businessman, said Fortune, could not do anything of importance today without generating a problem in public relations. And it added significantly that while the phrase public relations had been used to designate all manner of public contacts, it had an inner meaning. That inner meaning was industrial statesmanship. Another article entitled "The Public is Not Damned" made the first direct examination of public relations as such. It examined in detail the public relations activities of such companies as American Telephone and Telegraph, General Electric, United States Steel, General Foods, the National Association of Manufacturers, and of such trade associations as the American Bankers Association and the Association of American Railroads. Fortune here defined public relations as the label used to describe, at one and the same time, techniques and objectives and the conduct of individual businesses as organizations of people banded together in an effort to make a living for themselves and a profit for investors. To this the magazine added, public relations is the name business gives to its recognition of itself as a political entity. Fortune then proceeded to divide the practice of public relations into 4 parts: 1. Poor propaganda, 2. Good propaganda, 3. Inquiry, and 4. Action. Poor propaganda, it said, fails to carry conviction. As examples, the magazine listed some of the material distributed by the National Association of Manufacturers and a few of the trade associations. Good propaganda, it then pointed out, deals with the issues in which the public is interested and illuminates them with new and credible facts. One example of this type of propaganda was that spread by General Electric. The Hayes office was described as easily the most successful of the long-established group efforts at public relations. Ford and Chrysler were cited as men whose very characters are the major factor in the public relations of their companies. And American Telephone and Telegraph had the oldest conscious and continuous public relations program in American industry. This article concluded that if to any great extent the present interest in public relations can lead a sufficient number of businessmen to put considerations of public policy in first place in arriving at business decisions, a new era will indeed have arrived. Perhaps it can then at last be shown that the doctrine of enlightened self-interest has in it all the virtues that its sponsors have claimed. Thus the period from 1929 to 1941 marked a great turning point in the history of public relations. Through the work of individual public relations counsel, through a developing literature, through university courses, through widespread discussion in the lay, trade, business and scientific press, and through the increasing use of professional public relations guidance by government, business, labor, medicine, and other segments of our society, the new profession was not only growing but also broadening and deepening its point of view. Soon public relations began to be applied to the problems of American democracy as a whole. At the turn of the decade, the Depression had challenged public relations to develop the theory and practice of industrial statesmanship. Now, toward the close of the 1930s, the rise of Nazi Germany and the threat of war challenged American public relations men to contribute their share to the nation's efforts to combat attacks on our democracy. It seemed to me that it was the obligation of all who believed in democracy to do everything in their power to strengthen and preserve it, both in the United States and abroad. Along with many others, I also believe that modem propaganda techniques were important factors in psychological warfare and that the United States Army as well as the government must make good use of these techniques to build the morale of its own forces and achieve the highest efficiency in attacking the enemy. Articles appeared on all sides stressing the use of psychological warfare and the bolstering of morale among our own troops. One that I wrote appeared in the September to October 1940 issue of the Infantry Journal. In it I suggested that counter-propaganda could meet the strategy of terror employed by the enemy in the following ways: by continually emphasizing the weakness of the enemy, using facts, figures, and dramatization of our strong spots, and by deflating the attack of words before the enemy could launch it by calling attention to it, in advance, thus exposing the method and taking the wind out of its sails. As the decade came to a close, Europe was already engaged in World War II. By the summer of 1941, the armed forces became keenly interested in public relations. In June of that year I addressed the Industrial College of Armed Forces on public relations during World War I and changes in psychological approach and technical development since 1917. At that time I suggested a public relations program for the United States designed to maintain high morale, proposing a United States Government Morale Commission of expert advisors to draw up a master plan for morale and psychological warfare, a program to strengthen faith in democracy, a program to strengthen democracy itself, and a program to sell the armed forces to the people and the people to the armed forces. 6 months later came Pearl Harbor. The United States was embarked upon total war, and coincident with war a new stage in the development of public relations began.